Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're going deep, and I mean deep, into a case that's sure to send shivers down your spine.
Definitely a dark one.
Danny Bible. You might know him as the Ice Pick Killer.
A moniker he unfortunately earned.
His story, well, it's a long one.
Yeah, it spans decades. From his first murder in '79 all the way to his execution in 2018.
We're talking brutality, escapes, legal twists and turns, you name it.
It's all there. And it really raises some tough questions about how our justice system handles these kinds of offenders.
Absolutely. For this deep dive, we've dug into legal documents, news articles, anything we could get our hands on to try to piece together this complex puzzle.
What's especially fascinating, to me at least, is how Bible's case kind of intersects with these broader issues of justice, rehabilitation, you know, even the death penalty.
It's not just about one man's crimes, right? It's sort of a reflection of bigger societal issues.
Exactly.
So let's start at the beginning. 1979, Bible commits his first murder.
A young woman, Inez Deaton, just 20 years old,
And as the nickname suggests, he used an ice pick.
stabbed her multiple times. The brutality, right from the start, it really sets the tone for his later crimes.
It's chilling. Now, he was actually sentenced to 25 years for this murder, but here's the thing. He was paroled after only 9 years.
Yeah, that's where things start to get complicated. You got to remember the context of the time. Late 70s, early 80s, the focus was different.
How so?
Well, there was a big emphasis on rehabilitation. Parole was seen as like a key tool for getting offenders back into society.
But someone who commits such a brutal murder, how could they even be considered for parole?
Right. It seems unthinkable now. But back then, parole boards looked at various factors: behavior in prison, psychological evaluations, the risk they might pose to the community if released.
Still, it's hard to imagine they thought he wouldn't reoffend.
It was a tragic miscalculation,
Yeah.
one that unfortunately had terrible consequences. After his release, his violence didn't just continue, it escalated.
Which brings us to 1983 and the triple murder in Weatherford, Texas. His victims, Pamela Hudgens, Tracy Powers, and her 4-month-old baby, Justin.
This case, it just shows a complete lack of restraint. Not only does he kill a mother and her friend, but he also murders an infant.
It's almost beyond comprehension.
And the details, they're just awful. He put their bodies in his car trunk, drove to another town to get rid of them. It speaks to a level of planning, a coldness that's really disturbing.
And then he just disappears, abandons his wife's car at an airport, vanishes.
He was resourceful, I'll give him that. Knew how to evade capture. He wasn't just reacting. He was thinking ahead, blending in, and tragically continuing his violence.
And his next stop, Montana, just a few months later.
Targeted his ex-girlfriend, Leanne Miller.
And it wasn't just her. He also went after her babysitter, and most disturbingly, her 11-year-old daughter.
Yeah, the Montana crimes, those are particularly chilling. He invades their home, terrorizes his ex, ties up the women, and then the assault on the young girl.
It's hard to even talk about.
It goes beyond rage or impulsivity. It's about control, dominance, a complete disregard for the safety of others, the sanctity of a home.
Thankfully, this is where his luck runs out. The Montana spree led to his arrest in Florida in early '84. You'd think that would be the end of it, but the legal battles that followed, well.
They're a whole other story. They expose some of the limitations, let's say, of our legal system when it comes to holding repeat offenders like Bible accountable for all their crimes.
So he's brought back to Texas, right, to stand trial.
Right. But only for Pamela Hudgens' murder.
Wait, what about Tracy Powers and her baby? Why wasn't he charged for their murders?
It all comes down to evidence. At the time, they just didn't have enough to directly link him to the Powers murders.
You mean like forensic evidence?
Exactly. Back then, forensic science wasn't as advanced. And without that concrete physical evidence, it's incredibly tough to secure a conviction, especially when you're talking about a crime that happened months earlier in another state.
So he basically got away with murder.
It's a harsh reality, but sometimes, even with strong suspicion, you just don't have the evidence to make the charges stick.
Unbelievable. So he gets 25 years for Hudgens' murder, and then another 20 years for the Montana crimes.
Right, but those sentences ran concurrently.
Right.
Meaning he served them at the same time. So essentially, he was eligible for parole after serving the longer sentence, the 25 years for Hudgens' murder.
So even though he was convicted of multiple murders, he could be out in 25 years.
That was the system at the time. And it definitely raises questions about whether that was adequate punishment for someone with his history of violence.
Doesn't seem like justice, does it? And to make matters worse, he was paroled in 93.
After only 9 years.
9 years? How could they let him out? Did they not see the danger he posed?
The parole board, they have a tough job. They have to weigh so many factors. The offender's behavior, the risk to the community. And in Bible's case, they clearly made a terrible mistake.
A mistake with devastating consequences.
No doubt about it. Because, well, his release marked the start of another horrifying chapter, a chapter that exposed even more failures in the system and really makes you wonder about the effectiveness of rehabilitation in certain cases. But maybe we should pause here for a second. Take a breath.
Yeah, good idea. This is a lot to process. What stands out to you about these early crimes? About Bible himself?
It's the escalation. With each crime, the violence, the planning, it just gets worse. Like he was testing the limits, seeing how far he could go.
And tragically, he went pretty far before facing any real consequences. We talked about how his early release was a huge mistake, right?
Oh, yeah, massive one.
And it allowed him to, well, to continue the pattern of abuse. You said this next chapter exposes more failures of the system.
It does. Because after he gets out in 93, he goes back to Montana, and over the next 5 years, he sexually abuses 5 of his nieces.
All minors.
All minors.
It's just sickening. The betrayal of trust,
Yeah.
the damage he inflicted on those young girls. How did it finally come to light?
Well, it takes a while. It's not until 1998, when Bible's in Louisiana, that things really catch up to him.
Okay, what happened in Louisiana?
He attacks a woman named Tara Robinson
Where did he attack her?
in her hotel room, brutally assaults her, and then tries to kidnap her. He actually stuffed her into a duffel bag.
Oh my God, this feels like a turning point in the story. Why do you think it was this crime that finally led to his capture?
I think it's a few things. First, Tara Robinson, she fought back. She survived. And she was able to give the police a detailed account of what happened.
That makes a huge difference, obviously.
Huge. And you also have to consider the time period. By the late 90s, law enforcement was more vigilant, I'd say. DNA testing was becoming more common. There was greater awareness about the dangers of repeat offenders like Bible.
So basically, his luck finally ran out.
You could say that. He gets arrested and sent back to Louisiana to face charges for the attack on Tara Robinson.
And this is where things take a strange turn, right?
You could say that. While he's awaiting trial in Louisiana, Bible confesses.
Confesses to what?
To a bunch of unsolved crimes. Well, he admits to the 1979 murder of Inez Deaton.
Wow. The one he got paroled for.
The one and only. And he also confesses to the murders of Tracy and Justin Powers.
The mother and baby from Texas. After all these years, why do you think he confessed? Was it remorse? Or maybe a way to try and get a lighter sentence?
It's hard to know for sure what was going on in his head. Some people think he was trying to manipulate the system, hoping a confession might lead to a plea deal or something.
That makes sense.
Others believe it was about control, like a final act of defiance before he knew he was going to be held accountable.
So even his confession is shrouded in mystery.
Pretty much. But one thing's for sure. Those confessions opened up old wounds. And they gave some hope to the families of his victims, especially those who'd been denied justice for so long.
I can imagine. What happened next?
Well, the Texas authorities, they saw this as their chance to finally get him for the Powers murders. So they charged him with Deaton's murder too, and got him extradited back to Texas for trial.
Must have been a relief for the families.
I'm sure it was. Long time coming. And in 2003, he was found guilty. First-degree murder. Sentenced to death.
Finally, some justice. But even with a death sentence, his story wasn't over, was it?
Nope. About a month after his conviction, he was being transported to death row. And, well, there was a pretty horrific accident.
God, what happened?
The prison van he was in crashed. Head-on collision with a pickup truck. The guard driving the van was killed, and so was the driver of the other truck.
Yeah, in Bible.
He survived, but he had a broken vertebra, needed surgery, suffered lasting damage too, headaches, blackouts, the whole 9 yards.
Wow. That accident must have thrown another wrench into the legal proceedings.
Big time. His lawyers jumped on it, of course, argued that executing him in that condition would be cruel and unusual punishment. Violation of the Eighth Amendment.
What other reasoning?
They said finding a vein for the lethal injection would be difficult, could cause him a lot of pain. Plus, with his existing health issues, the whole thing would just be inhumane, they argued.
Makes you think, right? About what constitutes cruel and unusual punishment.
It's a tough question. And this case really highlights how complex the issue is.
So, what did the courts decide?
Ultimately, they ruled against Bible. They looked at his medical records and said there wasn't enough evidence to support the claims about difficulty finding a vein. And they basically said his health problems weren't severe enough to warrant a stay of execution.
So, the execution was still on the table.
It was. But the decision, it definitely stirred things up.
I bet. It's such a divisive issue, capital punishment.
It is. And as Bible's execution date got closer, the whole debate kind of exploded. Some people felt it was absolutely justified no matter what. He committed horrific crimes. He deserved the ultimate punishment. Others, though, they argued it was inhumane. Point blank. They said his health should have been a mitigating factor.
So, even in this final stage, Danny Bible's case was a lightning rod.
You could say that.
Hmm.
It really exposed the fault lines in our society when it comes to the death penalty.
It really does make you think, where do you draw the line? On one hand, you have the Eighth Amendment protecting against cruel and unusual punishment. But then you have the families of the victims who've been through so much. How do you balance those things?
It's a tough question. No easy answers, for sure. I mean, what's the goal of our justice system? Are we just looking for revenge? Or is it something more humane, even when dealing with someone like Danny Bible?
Yeah, his case really brings that question to the forefront, doesn't it? Because he was executed despite his health problems, and that just reignited the whole debate about capital punishment.
Yeah, it did. And it makes sense, right? It's such a complex issue with strong feelings on both sides. Some people believe it's the only just punishment for certain crimes, while others think it's wrong no matter what.
Right, and Bible's case just amplified all of that.
Definitely.
So it all culminated on June 27, 2018. Danny Bible was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas.
Bringing an end to a long and complicated story,
It's reported that he didn't say any final words.
which is pretty common, actually.
But some witnesses said they heard him say things like, "it hurts" and "burning" after the drugs were administered.
Yeah, those claims definitely added another layer to the whole thing. Whether he meant to say those things or not, it makes you think about the physical reality of an execution, about the suffering involved.
It's a heavy thing to consider. And it's a stark reminder that the death penalty, well, there's no going back. Once it's done, it's done.
There's definitely no room for error.
So, how did people react to his execution? I imagine there were mixed feelings.
Oh, absolutely. For some people, especially those close to the victims, there was a sense of relief, closure. They felt like justice had finally been served.
I can only imagine what a weight that must have been lifted for them, knowing that he couldn't hurt anyone else.
Right? It was the end of a long and painful chapter for them. But for others, those who were against the death penalty no matter what, it was a different story. They saw it as a tragedy, a failure of the system. They said it was inhumane, regardless of what he did. And they felt strongly that his health should have spared him from execution.
So even in death, Danny Bible continued to be a controversial figure. His case really highlights the deep divide in our society over capital punishment.
Yeah, for sure. It's a debate that's not going away anytime soon. And it's one that we all need to grapple with, I think.
This whole deep dive has been pretty heavy. It's easy to get lost in the legal details, the arguments for and against the death penalty. But at the end of the day, this is about real people, people whose lives were shattered by Bible's actions.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember all the victims, not just the ones who lost their lives, but also those who survived his attacks and their families who continue to live with the trauma. And, we can't forget about his own family either. His nieces, who he abused, his children, they're all victims too, in a way, living with the consequences of his actions.
It's a reminder that violence has a ripple effect. It touches so many lives, and the pain can linger for generations.
It's true.
Danny Bible's story is a dark one, full of missed opportunities, failures in the system, and just the sheer brutality of his crimes.
It really does make you question a lot of things. About how we handle violent offenders, about the death penalty, about the nature of evil itself.
It's been a challenging deep dive, no doubt, but I think it's been an important one.
I agree.
It's not enough to just recount the details of what happened. We have to use cases like this to learn something, to try to prevent future tragedies, and to hopefully create a more just and compassionate world.
I think that's the goal.
Yeah.
Keep the conversation going.
Exactly. Well, on that note, we're going to wrap things up. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the life and crimes of Danny Bible.
And thanks for listening, everyone.
We hope this is giving you some insight into this complex and disturbing case, and maybe even spark some important conversations.